This is a program that I've been looking forward to because security assistance has been something that I worked on when I was at the Department of State. And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce and then later ask a couple of questions to Lee Litzenberger. He's a senior advisor in the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs, which really in effect means he's the acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, because he manages the Bureau and the policy and the personnel and the budget, et cetera. Lee has had a very full and interesting career. He's been the Deputy Chief of Mission to NATO, to Belgrade, to Bishkek, and he's been the Deputy Senior Civilian Representative in Kabul. So he's been around and in some very exciting positions. So I look forward to hearing what Lee has to say. He'll make a few remarks. I'll engage him with a couple of questions, and then unfortunately we both have to scoot out of here pretty promptly at 2 o'clock. But a couple of housekeeping remarks. We're videotaping this for our website, so please mute your telephones. Don't turn them off, because we invite you to tweet us. And if you could use the hashtag MEI security, that way your remarks will get wide coverage. Again, welcome, and let's hear from Lee.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Chamberlain, for your kind introduction and for inviting me to speak today on this important topic in this very lovely venue, even if it's not your headquarters. Security assistance is a very complex foreign policy tool, and the Middle East is a very complex and conflicted region. So I'm really delighted to be here to have this opportunity to discuss our policy process regarding security assistance and the Middle East. Having been detailed to the German Marshall Fund just for a few months before joining the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, I really do know and appreciate firsthand how effective the expertise resident here in DC in the think tank community can be in helping us better shape our policies. So before diving into or turning to the issue of U.S. arms transfers in the region, I'd like to take a moment and outline the range of security cooperation activities that the Political Military Bureau oversees at the Department of State, because arms transfers are an integral part of what is a much broader process. And the role of the State Department is to bring foreign policy considerations into that process. So in PM, in addition to our role in overseeing and licensing over $153 billion in annual defense exports, both government to government and commercial sales, PM also develops and manages military grant assistance, the policy and the funding, which amounted to over $7 billion in FY 2017. This part of what we oversee includes foreign military financing or grants that facilitate the acquisition of U.S. military equipment, services, and training, the International Military Education and Training, or IMET program, which contributes to the professionalization of foreign militaries and forms lasting relationships and peace between our militaries. It also includes peacekeeping operations funding, which supports not only peacekeeping training, but security capacity building, security sector reform, counterterrorism, and stabilization efforts. Now, in addition to all of that, PM has funding for nonproliferation, anti-terrorism, demining, and related programs to assist partners with either securing vulnerable stockpiles of small arms and light weapons, including man-portable air defense systems or MANPADS, but also clearing landmines, IEDs, and other explosive remnants of war. Now, more broadly, as I hinted at in the beginning, we provide diplomatic support and foreign policy advice to the Department of Defense to ensure that U.S. foreign policy goals and objectives fundamentally inform the decision-making in all security sector assistance with our allies and partners. Now, through all of these lines of effort, what we're seeking to do is to build enduring security partnerships around the world that advance U.S. national security objectives. And our foreign policy is at the heart and center of this process. So the Bureau of Political Military Affairs and the State Department more broadly plays a critical role in overseeing these activities because, as Bilal has pointed out in his very engaging paper, security assistance and security cooperation are and should be tools of foreign policy. These policy tools are a means to an end. They are not the end in and of themselves. What they do, if they're used properly, is they develop the defense capabilities of our partners and allies. They facilitate interoperability between U.S. and partner militaries. And, of course, they build and strengthen relationships between our countries that help us address global and regional security challenges collectively. That's the goal. Now, recently, in the face of growing authorities and resources for DoD's security assistance programs, which have been growing, Secretaries Tillerson and Mattis have committed personally to improving state DoD coordination in managing the security assistance programs. For example, the two departments have created a security sector assistance steering committee through which state and DoD work together to determine how best to utilize both departments' security assistance funding in support of the administration's priorities. And this kind of high-level coordination and cooperation is new, and it's important, and it stems from the personal commitment of the two secretaries. Now, in the longer term, our goal is to extend this initial state DoD cooperation to include synchronizing our budget requests and to refining the use of each of our department's authorities. And despite what you may have read, the State Department has the resources and capacity it needs to continue to perform a leading role in this process. Now, turning to the Middle East, we have pressing concerns in the region, and our efforts to counter the destabilizing spillover effects of open conflict, of violent extremism, and defeating ISIS in particular, of porous borders, state failure, malign influence from Iran, and encroachment by Russia are significant. Balancing these immediate concerns with the longer-term strategic objectives of stability and development requires virtually day-to-day management and coordination across the defense, diplomacy, and development agencies of the U.S. government. Now, one example of how this has worked successfully, I would argue, is our security partnership with Lebanon, where we have empowered an ally to promote regional stability and reduce threats from hostile non-state actors. In recent years, the Lebanese Armed Forces, or LAF, have emerged as a well-trained, well-equipped, and fully capable fighting force, one that many Lebanese now see as the sole legitimate defender of Lebanon, thanks in large part to U.S. security assistance. The United States has provided nearly $1.7 billion in security assistance to Lebanon since 2006. This long-term partnership and investment is showing outsized dividends for our interests in the region. Since the start of the conflict in Syria, the LAF have fought bravely on the front lines against ISIS and against al-Qaeda, and they have repelled serious incursions into Lebanese territory. In the summer of 2017, the LAF executed a very successful campaign in Ras Baalbek, eliminating ISIS inside its borders. This LAF operation demonstrates the Lebanese Armed Forces' professionalism, their resolve, and their strong capabilities, all of which were fostered and continue to be fostered with U.S. training and equipment. And the Lebanese people themselves have taken notice of the LAF's newfound capabilities, which directly undermine Hezbollah's false narrative that it alone can and should provide security for Lebanon. This is a successful example of how security assistance can work. Now, in addition to supporting the professionalism of the LAF, the United States has also provided over $60 million to support the clearance of unexploded ordnance that remains from the multiple conflicts that Lebanon has suffered. This U.S. assistance has enabled the Lebanon Mine Action Center to strengthen and build its capacity, and Lebanon now serves as a critical regional hub for bolstering capacity for conventional weapons destruction across the region. Again, this is a success. Now, I want to turn to Bilal's paper briefly. In his paper, he made a few recommendations for the State Department that I'd like to address. One, he recommended that U.S. security assistance has to be integrated into a broader U.S. Middle East strategy and linked more directly to clearly defined U.S. policy goals. Two, that we need to craft clearer policies toward our Arab partners to allow for more effective arming, funding, and training of their militaries. Three, that it is vitally important for Washington to try to understand its Arab partners' perspectives on their own national security and U.S. security assistance. And I welcome all three of those recommendations, and I think we're making some headway on all three. With regard to the first point, I hope that the example I've given illustrates that our security assistance is, in fact, rooted directly in our goals for the region. Where that goal is and has been defeating ISIS, we're providing our partners with the means to win the battles and keep the peace. Where the goal is to ensure that our partners can defend themselves and maintain regional stability, we are ensuring that they have the capability to do so, whether in the form of air defense systems or in weapons systems that provide a deterrent effect in general and an ability to strike accurately when needed. And across the board, we're supporting our partners' efforts to reform their defense and security institutions from the ministerial level on down so that they have a sustainable capacity to ensure their security. Let me combine my responses to Bilal's second and third recommendations and say this. I think that for a lot of our friends and allies, the United States will always be the partner of choice. And certainly, it's in our interest that partners build militaries that are capable of contributing to countering mutual threats. But we can't forget that we're not the only available option to these countries. That's one reason the Department is working with our partners to better understand their requirements and their perspectives. Defense resourcing conferences are one tool we use. They're bilateral engagements where we sit down with our partners to listen to them and identify requirements that fit their security situations and our collective shared vision for the region. And then we can work with them to align resources to meet those requirements. We started this process with Pakistan first, and then included Egypt and Jordan, and we hope to expand to more partners as we move forward. Now, at the same time, we recognize that we may not always agree with the sovereign decisions that our partners make regarding how they wish to spend their own national funds. Nationally funded arms transfers provide capabilities to our partners and can also help form the basis of valuable relationships. When the United States approves a foreign military sale of major defense articles, like a squadron of fighter aircraft, that package will include training for the pilots who operate those jets, maintenance of the jets over the life of the life service of the equipment, and other services that require the United States and the recipient country to cooperate on security matters over the lifetime of the system. We take a long-term view of balancing the need to encourage certain capabilities that are in our interest to see partners develop, and in building and maintaining the long-term security relationship that we have seen pays dividends. Provided that a proposed sale, and I'm talking about sales with national funds, not sales that the U.S. provides the funding for. Provided that a proposed sale does not run counter to our national interests regarding technology security, human rights, and regional arms balances, such transfers can be a means to demonstrate our reliability as a partner while laying the groundwork for future decades of security cooperation, which in turn gives us greater credibility when we do feel we need to urge our partners to consider our suggestions for focusing their investments. So in conclusion, Bilal has framed these important issues very well in his paper, and I hope it is widely read. We can all surely agree that security cooperation and assistance work best when they are coordinated with the many other foreign policy tools available to us, especially in a region where a range of complex issues requires a multifaceted approach, led first and foremost by diplomacy. It's our job in the Political Military Bureau to ensure that our security cooperation aligns with and advances U.S. strategic goals, and that everything the many and varied entities of the U.S. government are doing in foreign security sectors advances a coherent strategy. Now, as part of this work, as an important part of this work, we need to be constantly evaluating and assessing how well we conduct security cooperation. And we need to acknowledge and make adjustments when there's room for improvement. Starting in 2012, PM's Office of Security Assistance began including elements of monitoring and evaluation into military grant assistance as part of an internal process to look holistically at the effectiveness of our programs. We're committed to this, to continue this process and assess the effectiveness of our assistance in furthering U.S. foreign policy objectives and in recommending changes when they're needed. So thank you very much, and I look forward to our further discussion.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Lee. It's been a long time since I was a political military officer in the Department of State, but I'd like to follow up on my first question on this steering committee that Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson have formed. It's fascinating. You know, for years, there's a tension between the Defense Department and the State Department. State Department directed the policy for security assistance. The Defense Department implemented it, and I understand that those distinctions began to blur over the last couple of presidents. It sounds like we're getting back to that, but some of the disputes, for example, okay, let's take it. I was ambassador to Pakistan and got there right before 9/11. And when I walked in the door, we had for 10 years, 9-10 years, Pakistan had been without any security assistance, been cut off. A political decision made based on policy because Pakistan was developing a nuclear weapons capability. The Defense Department paid that price because IMET was cut off. A whole generation of young officers didn't meet each other, didn't know each other. When 9/11 occurred, and suddenly we need to reestablish very quickly mill-to-mill relations, we didn't have them.
Right.
There was a lot of hostility. There's a lost generation. There was a great deal of unhappiness. That's an example that I lived through, where decision on security assistance made on policy grounds hurt the military when we needed that good military relationship. How can this steering committee fix that? Is that what it's designed to do?
Well, I think it's designed to do that, but more as well. I think, as I see the steering committee, it's part of a process of trying to lash up DoD and state at all stages of the security assistance process. I think the process that you were more familiar with would involve state and DoD linking up at discrete points in the process, but not necessarily all along the way. I think we're trying to do this more holistically. And in part, it's a reflection of the changes in security assistance. We've seen security assistance triple in size since 9/11. And we've seen Congress authorize new security assistance authorities to DoD. So whereas state used to manage 80% of security assistance, it's now about 50%, and DoD has the other 50%. So we have to adjust to that. And I think this is what Secretaries Tillerson and Mattis realized, that this requires very close coordination among our two departments at every stage of the way. We can't just do business the way we used to do it, because we did run into situations where we would have conflict. And there are always going to be different perspectives from different institutions. That's why we need that constant engagement. And I will tell you that we are increasingly very well lashed up with DoD. Now, to your point, when I went through some of the programs that the Political Military Bureau manages. One of them is IMET, and it's a very, very significant program precisely for the reason you pointed out, that it builds that long-term security relationship. The young major or captain who comes over to the U.S. for either training on a weapons system or for Command General Staff College type of thing, in 10 or 15 years may become the CHOD for that country. And if they have had long-standing relationships with the U.S., it just makes it easier for us to have a dialogue and communication. I do think we've learned that lesson from the Pakistan experience, and I was in the department when that decision was made to interrupt the relationship, and it was a very, very difficult decision to make. It was not made lightly, but I don't think anyone understood the long-term consequences. So I think there's full agreement between state and DoD that the purpose of security assistance is to build partnerships, partners, and allies who have the capabilities to be able to interoperate with us, with our systems, and join us in coalitions where we need to face collectively the threats we face. We've seen this in Afghanistan. We've seen it in the Defeat ISIS coalition. The reason we've been able to build those coalitions is because those countries have this long-standing security relationship with the U.S. Many of them operate U.S. systems. They've been to our training schools. They understand how to work with us, and they're able to complement what the U.S. brings to the table. And then we're able to have partners. And the more capable our partners are, the less requirements are going to fall on the U.S. And this gets to the whole burden sharing issue as well.
I have a kajillion questions I'd like to ask you, but Lee has to leave promptly at 2 o'clock, so I'm going to hold back and open it up to the audience for a question or two, maybe only 2, unfortunately. Yes. If you could wait for the microphone, since we are taping this. It's right here. Just.
Ambassador Chamberlain, thank you. I'm Steve Brosnan. I'm the Middle East Director at Raytheon International. And sir, this is a question for you. I'm curious to see your thoughts, or hear your thoughts rather, on security assistance, the relationship with Egypt, and specifically where we're at with cash flow financing.
I'm going to defer, that's a very good question. I'm going to defer to the panel that's up next. We have some Egyptian experts. Michele Dunne will be on that panel. Egypt is one of the programs that's in the news very frequently. In fact, this morning, with regards to the story about cluster bomb use in Sinai, which I think has implications for the Political Military Bureau in some of our transfer arrangements. I'm not up to date on that, so I'm humbly going to pass it to the panel to see if they could address that.
I can say we're certainly looking into that issue. It's one of many issues we're looking at with relation to our security relationship with Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Second question, right here.
Good afternoon. It's Russian Embassy, Arthur Lukmanov, Senior Counselor. Mr. Litzenberger, could you please elaborate on the issue you handle in your work with the DoD in terms of disarming? You mentioned disarming and collecting manpads, which were proliferated in the Middle East, especially after Libya. You know, thousands of stockpiles were looted by terrorists and extremists, and now we see many more incidents in the air, planes falling, helicopters falling. Any progress on that side? And also you mentioned demining, elaborations on demining in Raqqa. We see city in rubbles, and every week there are tens of 10 to 15 wounded or killed because of mines. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that question. So we do have a very active program to do a number of things regarding small arms and light weapons. So there are many countries that have stockpiles of old weapons that just need to be destroyed so they don't fall into the wrong hands. And we help them do that in a safe manner and an accountable manner. There are many parts of the world where there are mines left over from conflict. We see this in the Balkans, we see this in Southeast Asia, we see it in Syria and Iraq now. And the State Department has programs working through professional trained contractors to clear these areas, demine these areas. We have very active programs right now in Iraq and in other areas where ISIS has been removed from the area, but they've left behind an extensive array of IEDs and other kinds of booby traps designed to kill the local population. So before people can move back into their homes, we have to go there and clear the areas, and we're doing that, and we're actively committed to that. You also talked about man pads. We're very focused on the need to try and account for and destroy as many man pads as possible so they're not out on the black market. And we work very closely with partners and allies around the world on this program, and we've had quite a bit of success.
I think we have one more question. Let's get a woman in red.
Thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today. You use Lebanon as a...
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. Mara Karlin. I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS. You spoke about Lebanon as a success, and I'd be curious to hear the ways in which you think that the U.S. effort to build the Lebanese military has been less successful.
I'm not really sure how to answer that question. I think the efforts we've embarked on have paid dividends, and we've seen, the professionalism improve. We've seen the LAF step up to the task and the challenges that it's faced. So we're very pleased with that, and we want to continue to work with them to develop their professionalism and see the day where, in fact, they are the preeminent and sole defender of Lebanon.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Litzenberger. We really appreciate your coming.
Thank you.
And
this was a delight.
Yeah, and joining us today. And we have a very interesting panel that will be following us.
And I'm sorry I have to leave and won't hear it, but I know it'll be a very interesting discussion.
Good.
Thank you
Please
again.
join me in thanking.
My name is Missy Ryan. I'm a reporter with The Washington Post. I cover military issues and national security, often with a focus on the Middle East. And it's my great pleasure to be here with this distinguished panel today. And we are going to be looking at the same topics, some of the same issues that were addressed by Lee and Wendy, but with some additional details. And we're going to be able to have about 90 minutes to delve in here. We're going to have a panel discussion and then open it up to questions from the audience. So look forward to hearing your thoughts. First of all, I want to just briefly introduce the panelists here today. We have Bilal Saab at the end, who's a senior fellow and director of the Defense and Security Program at the Middle East Institute. He specializes in the Levant and the Persian Gulf. Next to me here, I have Michele Dunne, who is the director and a senior fellow at Carnegie's Middle East Program, where her research focuses on political and economic change in Arab countries, particularly Egypt, as well as U.S. policy on the Middle East. So it's a lot to tackle right there. And then to my left, we have Mara Karlin, who is a non-resident senior fellow in the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. And she is an associate professor of Practice of Strategic Studies at the Johns Hopkins SAIS School, where she serves as associate director of the school's Strategic Studies Program and is executive director of the Merrill Center for Strategic Studies. And last but not least, we have Justin Reynolds. Justin joined the Cohen Group after 11 years in the United States Air Force, where he led combat and peacetime airlift operations and logged over 3,000 hours as a C-17 pilot. In his final assignment, Justin served as an instructor, evaluator pilot, and the director of operations for a deployed C-17 flying unit responsible for combat airlift operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I'm sure you've got lots of good stories from all that, Justin. So I think I'd like to open up today. Our panelists are going to make some brief introductory remarks on an array of topics. And I think it's best probably to start with Bilal so he can address the findings of his article, which was very interesting, and I urge you all to read it if you haven't done so already. So we'll just kick it off with Bilal.
Thank you, Missy. Thank you for agreeing to do this. It's a pleasure to be on a panel with such distinguished individuals, but also old friends. It's always more fun, really, to do these things with people you know. This is an important subject. It's almost a full house. That shows that there is a lot of interest in this subject. This is not just about national security. This is not just about foreign policy. It's also about your own hard-earned money. It's my own money, too. It's in your name. It's in my name that the United States government pursues these military assistance programs in faraway places the majority of Americans know really very little about. So at the very least, what I want to know, what you want to know, is whether these programs are actually working. And if they're not, what is the reason? So 8 months ago when I joined this place, it's funny, 16 years ago I was an intern at MEI. I started a project on U.S. military assistance to the Arab partners. And what I wanted to understand is why there were just more things going wrong than things actually going right, why there were more bad news than good news coming out of this space. And I had a chance to talk to a number of people in the State Department and the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, and even the Department of Homeland Security, basically anybody who had a responsibility for security assistance. And that investigative process was really rewarding. I learned a ton, and that prompted me basically to write the piece that I have in the national interest in this current issue of the magazine. So what I'd love to do is, just with the 5 minutes left I have, is share with you some of the key findings. Focus more on the problems, frankly, than the recommendations. If we have time for that in the Q&A, I'm happy to go over those. Lee himself very nicely mentioned some of them. But when we talk about security assistance, obviously we're talking about the supplier, that's us, and then the recipient, in this case, it's the Arab partners. So there are problems on both ends, okay? What we typically have done over the years is conveniently ignore our own problems and blame most of the failures on the recipients. I mean, that's convenient, that's nice, but it's just wrong. It's that simple. So I'll start with the problems on the supplier end, on our end, and then I'll move over to the recipient's end. The number one problem that I see, and I think Lee mentioned it, is it's not about the type of funding that we provide, the qualities, the arms that we sell, how many, too few, too many. It's none of those things, really. The source of all maladies of security assistance for me really is the lack of a coherent policy towards the recipient countries. If the policy itself is not clear, it's not coherent, everything else falls apart. And that's why I wanted to emphasize, as Lee mentioned, is that this tool, as powerful as it is, it's still a tool. It is a tool, it is a means to an end, as opposed to the other way around. We have been treating it for far too long as an end in itself, and obviously that's wrong. That's the number one problem I see on the supplier end. And then Lee mentioned in length, obviously, the interagency process. In my own opinion, it's just not working at a high level. Okay, there's a lot of improvements that have been made over the years. Lee has mentioned a few. The jointness, the joint planning, the greater coordination between state and DoD. But in my view, it's still really lacking. And there's a number of reasons for that, which I can't get into in the interest of time. But the fact that this interagency process is not happening, obviously, effectively, it does not. It's just not good news, and it has an effect on the very effectiveness of security assistance. Third problem is, and Mara will tell you much more about this, this is hard. This is really hard to do. Even if the policy itself is coherent, and if it's clear, it's very hard to do security assistance with politically fragile and militarily weak partners. In this case, it's the Arab partners, okay? This requires an enormous amount of commitment, political, an enormous amount of resources, and a lot of patience. This is not easy to do, and especially at a time when you mention the word nation building in any government agency, people freak out and leave the building. So we're not only not really good at it, we're decreasingly interested in doing this, despite the emphasis on it. Fourth problem is, it's a simple one, but it's still big. Beyond the lack of coordination between state and DoD that is not optimal, there's a personnel problem in Foggy Bottom and also in the Pentagon. By that I mean there's just not enough people, Arab country specialists, who understand both the region but also security assistance. We don't have a process of systematically trying to collect the experiences of those officers who have served in the region to build some kind of an institutional memory of this enterprise, which is huge. Those are the four main problems that I see on the supplier end. On the recipient end, and these are no less fundamental or serious, just very quickly. Lee mentioned it. The Arab partners obviously have different perceptions and priorities than we do. And if you don't think that's going to affect security assistance, then obviously think again. We say ISIS, they say Iran. Okay, we say Iran now, they'll say, well, yes, but. As in, we as a collective group don't see the Iranian threat similarly. And worse, we don't even know how to address it jointly. If you don't think that's going to affect security assistance, of course it is. Capacity issues. And again, Mara will mention that since she has analyzed it in her book and in her piece in Foreign Affairs. And by the way, I should recommend two pieces on this issue, both by Mara and Justin, one in Foreign Affairs and one in the American Interest. They're both extremely interesting. When it comes to capacity deficiencies, I mean by that, they're just old, deep problems with the way Arab states do national security. This process has a number of issues starting from organization, professionalism, all the way to culture and politics. And we can get into those in detail in the Q&A. The fact that there are major divergences between how we do business and how they do business obviously is going to affect security assistance. And the difference itself is not the problem. There are many differences that we have with our European allies, but the fact that we haven't been able to manage them effectively, that's the issue. There's a reason why our consultation processes with NATO allies work so much better than with the Arab partners. It's not because we have defense pacts with the NATO allies, it's because the cultural synergies are much greater. And the fact that we talk much more effectively, that's the problem. It's not the very divergence in cultures. Obviously, we're going to have different cultures. Last problem that I see is not just capacity, but willingness. And I understand that. There's a lot of good reasons why the Arab partners, in many instances, just don't want to cooperate with us very closely. They want to keep a lot of the secrets that they have. These are sovereign countries. But obviously, that affects security assistance. And they definitely don't want to cooperate when the political relationship is experiencing turbulence. And that was, frankly, the case during the past 8 years with the Obama administration. I'll offer one conclusion. There are a number of measures that have been instituted over the years to try to fix security assistance. Every single president since Jimmy Carter has tried to fix this, and they've all had different ideas. But they all have struggled because, and I think Lee has mentioned it, because this process of reintegrating security assistance into the overall foreign policy process has been lacking. State and foreign policy should be the driving force of security assistance and not the other way around. I'll stop here.
I think we're going to turn to Mara.
Great. Okay. Thanks so much for convening this great discussion, Bilal. So my comments are based on being a scholar of these issues. I have a new book out, Building Militaries in Fragile States, as Bilal was kind enough to mention, but also a practitioner. So I've worked for the last 5 secretaries of defense, often on these issues, trying to build the Lebanese military, the Pakistani military, a whole bunch of others, militaries and security services. And the biggest, I guess, flaw, the biggest reason that U.S. military assistance programs disappoint, because, spoiler alert, they usually do, and that's not just a Middle East story, and the reason is because the United States traditionally approaches these as technical exercises, not political ones. We focus on stuff. We focus on training, and we focus on equipment. And that is a fundamentally flawed approach. And this story, the sort of examples that I'll outline as to kind of how the U.S. approaches this in such a technical manner is a story not just in the region, but it's also a Washington story, and an inside Washington story. So related to the dynamics between the executive and the legislative, the dynamics among the executive, as we heard a little bit about today in the questions, and then also between the United States and its partner in the region. So let me unpack for you what I mean when I'm saying the the United States approaches these as generally technical, not political efforts. And I'll use U.S. efforts to build the Lebanese military as I kind of trace through this. That's not accidental. I actually was the architect of that program now, I think 13 or so years ago, and spend a lot of time in my book talking about it. So you may be surprised that I'll have a lot of criticism for it. So number one is thinking about the mission. Why is the United States working with this military? What is it trying to achieve? So for Lebanon, for example, if you look at this effort that the United States launched right after the Hariri assassination, it was very much focused at one level on helping the Lebanese military exert the government's sovereignty throughout its territory. And if you spend time in Lebanon before this effort, you probably think there are some great successes along those lines. So I have all sorts of memories, as I'm sure Bilal does, of wandering around Lebanon at the very turn of the millennium, and you didn't see the Lebanese military anywhere. Once this effort actually took hold and the Lebanese military had the ability to be mobile, had more ammunition, it used to have only 3 to 5 bullets per soldier per year, suddenly you saw the Lebanese military all over the place. And the challenge, though, of course, is what is it actually doing? I think we have seen a few, and an emphasis on few, examples over the last decade plus of this program, which has cost $1.7 billion, I think, as we heard previously. Few attempts to take on actors that both the United States and the government in Beirut agreed were problematic. So Al-Qaeda types or ISIS types. What I would want to think through is, have those few examples been sufficient, and have they been worth the price? So as we think about mission, why internal to the United States? Why are we working with this military? What do we want to achieve? But why do they think we're working with them? What's actually their view of what we're trying to do? So we have a host of examples as we look to Lebanon, again, where the military thought that the U.S. was working with it for different reasons. There's a great example from 2008 where the Lebanese government decided to poke Hezbollah a little bit. Hezbollah responded to the poking by deploying throughout all of Beirut and starting firing on the Lebanese people. And those of us sitting in the Pentagon received a number of calls saying, the Lebanese military is just standing here. Will you send the Marines? That wasn't going to happen. Clearly, their views of why we were working with them were flawed. So issue one is the mission. Why are we working with them? Why did they think we're working with them? Issue two is the structure. How is this military structured? And is the United States willing, in a non-technical manner, to try to change it? So again, anyone who spent time in Lebanon, particularly with retired Lebanese military officers, knows every general officer has a number of staff, active duty Lebanese military officials, who are working for them, who are taking care of them. It's an extremely top-heavy organization, quite disproportionate, not only to other militaries in the region, but to the U.S. military as an example. Thirdly, the people, right? Who are the people in leadership in these militaries? And then also on the U.S. side, who's working on this effort? And this very much echoes, I think, a point Bilal is making in his superb piece. So in the partner military, what kind of leadership do you have? Do you have, as we've seen in Lebanon, a slew of individuals leading a force who are focused on trying to become president? Or are they actually trying to be the head of the military? That obviously will influence your incentives. What about at lower levels of the force, in key positions, say running the intel department? What do they think their role is, and who do they think that they should be working with? On the U.S. side, what are the relationships amongst those both in country, in the embassy in Beirut, and then also the unity of vision with D.C.? When the U.S. tried to build the Lebanese military once before, from 1982 to 1984, there's no shortage of extremely colorful examples of profound dislike and hatred amongst the embassy team. You can read all about this in archives or in my book. Anyone who has spent time in an embassy has probably seen this movie, though, more than once, right? Personalities matter, and how well they get along matter a lot. The willingness of the representatives in country to actually represent what Washington wants or not. So there's some tremendous examples in that last U.S. effort to work with the Lebanese military, where you had one senior U.S. official trying to convince the head of the military to conduct a coup. you had another senior U.S. official who was trying to get the head of the military to have access to a special cache of covert weapons after the individual was not in the head of the Lebanese military. So a slew of examples here again, both in country and then also with Washington. And then the final piece is assessment. To what extent are we assessing these efforts to work with these militaries in a technical way or in a political way? So there is, of course, a great desire to do so technically. How much training do we give them? How much equipment will we give them? The unfortunate case here, though, is that the United States and the U.S. system will never be the fastest. It just is not the case. We have a system designed to constrain power and to constrain action. And because of that, we will not be faster than, say, the Iranians or the Russians. So what this means is even in the best case scenario, where the United States is able to race assistance as quickly as possible, we get example after example of loud, vehement criticisms from those in the country saying the United States didn't do anything. There's these great lines from the head of the Lebanese military after the U.S. sent 40 C-130s and C-17s filled with military assistance while the Lebanese military was fighting its first battle, really ever. This was in 2007. And the head of the military said things like, "We didn't get anything but promises and best wishes." It's as though they wanted us to die first. So not a great success, at least in their eyes. So what does that mean then for assessment? What does that mean for the diagnosis both of the problem and the prescriptions to solve it? Especially because if building these militaries is so important, if it is a top priority, and that's an if, you might want to actually change the role of the United States and the U.S. military as things evolve. You might want to become a co-combatant at some point. The Marines in Lebanon are a really good example here. Marines who were receiving combat pay, and yet you have President Reagan saying, even after authorizing the U.S. Navy to start firing on the Syrian military and on militias, this still falls under the heading of self-defense. So what does this all mean for today? And I'll just take a brief moment and use Syria as an example. So in Syria today, I think you could argue that along just this issue of mission, there's a lot of confusion. Why is the U.S. military working with different partners in Syria? We've heard different things from the State Department and from the Pentagon and from the White House. Is it to counter ISIS? Is it to counter Iran's bad behavior? Is it to restrain the actions of the Assad regime? What are the various groups on the ground that the U.S. military is working with? What do they think the U.S. is there for? And of course, there are 2,000 U.S. military personnel there. How do we make sure they're there not just as a target? And then finally, all those adversaries, what do they think the U.S. is there for? Why did they think those 2,000 U.S. military personnel are in Syrian territory? And you could make all sorts of arguments about how this would make sense, but the strategic incoherence is dangerous. It's a dangerous conversation for us to have in Washington, and I think it is profoundly dangerous for those who are sitting, say, where Hezbollah is, or the Assad regime, or Moscow, where they're also probably wondering the purpose here. Thanks very much.
All right, Justin.
Thanks. First, I just want to say thank you to Bilal for inviting me here, and thanks to the Middle East Institute. I'm very proud to be a part of this, and interested to talk about something that's very near and dear to my heart, security assistance. So I'll just start briefly by talking about my role in security assistance and essentially how I've played a part, and then I'll talk a little bit more about how I see the enterprise in general. So as was mentioned, I'm by trade a C-17 guy. What that means is when I first started flying, I was assigned the C-17, and this was back in 2005. Was my first assignment out to McChord Air Force Base, that's in Washington. 2005, 2009 was that first trip, and you may remember that we were pretty busy operationally back then. So 2 fronts, 2 wars, and my wife who's here will attest, I was gone somewhere between 280 and 300 days a year, so a busy time. So I was offered the opportunity at the end of that assignment to take a different assignment, flying the T-6 Texan. That is the Air Force's primary training aircraft. The one caveat being that I would have to be doing that in Columbus, Mississippi, which is no Seattle. I'll say that. But despite being in the sort of backwoods of the South, you'd be interested to find that there at Columbus was a program, an IMET program. So Lee Litzenberger mentioned this, International Military Education and Training. So this is a subset of security assistance. And my role there as the Chief of Standards and Evaluations for the flying units was to make sure that our American pilots were well trained, as well as the international pilots who were part of this program called the Aviation Leadership Program, an IMET program. This program trained pilots primarily from countries who didn't have their own pilot training bases. So this is everyone from Iraqis, from people from Afghanistan, Nigeria, Poland, Honduras, Guatemala. We really got the whole gamut, and it was incredibly interesting. And as anyone who's been on the delivery end of security assistance, very challenging in terms of dealing with different cultural effects, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I was in a unique position that I've experienced security assistance both as a trainer and then also as a recipient, and I'll talk about that just a little bit later. But suffice it to say that training these pilots, these new partner pilots, was difficult. Training anyone to fly is very difficult. The program moves very quickly, it's very demanding, it's very high stress, and it's even more so when there's a language barrier, when there's a cultural barrier. But the pilots who were I was responsible for, both my instructors as well as my trainees, worked very, very hard to make this happen. Millions of dollars spent, thousands of hours spent crafting what was intended to be a very, very well-trained pilot. And this is the kind of person who you would hope, and this is what Michele Dunne mentioned, that one day might become the chief of staff of his or her Air Force. So I was proud of this accomplishment and proud of training these guys, but I got curious about what happened to them. Where did they go after training? And this is my first peek into, behind the curtain of security assistance, and as it turned out, and I was able to do a lot of research on this at the George C. Marshall Center, we didn't know where they went. Nobody knew what happened to these guys and gals. While we put all this energy and effort into making these people our allies, our partners, giving them this incredibly valuable skill, and I'll say this without boasting, that the United States Air Force's pilot training program is the best in the world. No offense to my Navy brothers. But we took these guys and made them very, very good, some of the best pilots in their respective countries. And oftentimes, and I found this through my research at the Marshall Center, you'd realize that these people would go back to their home countries and either be ostracized for their relationship with the United States, not allowed to fly because of whatever hierarchies were working out there, and more importantly, the people who were supposed to be keeping track of this incredibly valuable tool, this friend of the United States that we had created, was sort of lost in the shuffle of the bureaucracy, of the misunderstanding of what we had created. So I mentioned that I was also a recipient of security assistance. This was from the form of, at the Marshall Center, this is also another IMET program, the International Military Education and Training Program. I was one of a handful of Americans who got to go through that with 150 other folks from 52 different countries. This is primarily new NATO allies or aspiring NATO allies, and things were done very differently, and I won't get into all that, but just to say that I think there is a right way to do this, and there's certainly a wrong way to do this, the security assistance piece. But some of the problems that I have seen, or the more I've looked into this, really stem from our government, in many ways, our people, the citizens of the United States, asking for security assistance to do too much. It's often the first line of defense when it comes to engaging in a country where we don't feel like we have enough interest that we need to mobilize our regular forces, but enough interest that, okay, well, we'll train some folks there, we'll give them some weapons, and we'll see how things turn out. And the number that I'm sure will end up getting thrown around here at some point is, Afghanistan is a great point, and it's a little more complex, and Mara, you bring this up in your book, I know, but $70 billion, 15 years, and not a tremendous amount to show for it. So oftentimes these initial issues, and Syria is a great example of this, we spend a tremendous amount of money trying to get away or get around sending our own troops in. And then at the end of the day, perhaps they ask for that outcome as well. Another issue, and this sort of plays a part into it, and I mentioned it briefly, is that we ignore a lot of cultural factors when we deliver the weapons or the training, and figuring out how that particular training is going to be received, whether or not it's applicable to the country, whether or not they can actually use that training. You know, a great example, and there's many that abound in Afghanistan in particular, is that a particular program to help train the Afghan National Police was essentially was taken right out of what we had done in the 90s with the Balkans. This great PowerPoint slide deck, which had worked well enough, I guess. I'm not sure they ever really worked that well, but and given to the Afghan National Police to train these guys, and without recognizing that, hey, a lot of when you say someone's literate in Afghanistan, that does not mean the same thing as it does in parts of Western Europe. And there's a million examples of those kinds of oversights, or people not being careful enough about how we deliver this assistance. And then, of course, there's the interagency issue, which has been discussed as well. And I'll leave others to talk more about that. But I will say that just from the perspective of who has responsibility for these folks, who has responsibility for cultivating this ally, this partner, and making them, you know, a friend of the United States, who has been well-trained, who is professional in the same way that the United States military is, who respects human rights or has had human rights training. Now, these are all part of security assistance. This is required. And many of the FY 2017 NDAA reforms for security assistance seek to address this. We'll see how they come out. But obviously, it's still an issue that the lines have been blurred, and it's hard to understand what exactly the plan is. And the last thing I'll say is that there's not purposeful, but there often seems an inability or a lack of a desire to change security assistance. Panels like these, books like Mara's, research that's been done at the RAND. There's not a great deal of academic writing on this, but what there is generally has a pretty good consensus that we're ignoring a lot of cultural factors. We need to have a policy that directs this, that comes from State Department, but that doesn't happen. The tyranny of the urgent often takes over, and we've got to get these guys trained, and you got to understand this. You know, a combatant commander says, "Hey, I need this capability downrange," then it shall be. So I'll end my comments there. The last thing I'll caveat to say is that, all this aside, I am a fan of security assistance. I believe in it. I think it can do good. I think it is absolutely a useful tool, a useful foreign policy tool, and there are some examples of it working. And like anything, no plan survives first contact with the enemy, but there are ways that we can do this better, and I think we owe it to the people who we're asking to be our friends, as well as to our taxpayers, to make that so. Thanks.
Great. Okay, Michele.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, it's really interesting to hear from a practitioner of security assistance, as well as, you know, those of us who watch it a bit from the outside. So I've been asked to address one particular case, which is the case of U.S. security assistance to Egypt. This is one of these really long-running security relationships, a good four decades plus now. And we're on the order of $49 billion into this relationship with Egypt over all those years. Now, Bilal's very good article in the National Interest mentions several problems with security assistance to Arab partners in general, that such assistance often doesn't contribute to reaching U.S. policy goals in the region. In fact, I would say it is sometimes used for missions that, in fact, are at direct odds with U.S. interests. That security assistance in some cases has not enabled greater interoperability with U.S. forces, that it has sometimes been ineffective in building counterterrorism capacity, and that it sometimes becomes an end in itself rather than a means. In other words, that military assistance drives U.S. policy toward the country rather than the other way around. All of these apply to Egypt, and I know he cites several things about Egypt in his article. But so I want to make a few general points about this and just sort of put forward the dilemma that I think the United States faces in the relationship with Egypt overall. Two of these are going to be kind of broad points, and then I want to bring it down to the current moment and how this is operating with the Trump administration. So first of all, you know, the first point that I wrote down is one that I think several people have made already in different ways, which is that security assistance programs they're more than just practical help, right? Mara, you said a few minutes ago that the U.S. approaches these relationships as being technical in nature rather than political. But the point is they really are political, right? These security assistance relationships are a kind of a U.S. government stamp of approval, at least on the military of that country, and often sort of the government more broadly. And this is part of the problem that we have with Egypt. It's become more and more problematic as time goes on. So, you know, the Egyptian military, you know, certainly the United States wanted to reward the peace treaty with Israel and encourage the Egyptian military to, you know, take on a role that didn't involve going to war with Israel repeatedly and so forth. But what has happened in the last few years, and especially since the 2013 military coup, is that the military, of course, is more and more right out in front in Egypt, right? Whereas before it was always, you know, it was always the bedrock of the Egyptian government and the Egyptian regime, but there were civilian leaders who were out in front and so forth. Well, that's not the case now, right? Since 2013, you know, there was this military coup that ended a brief attempt at a democratic transition, and it has led to, you know, unprecedented human rights abuses, political repression, increasingly overt and extensive military involvement in the economy and so forth, all this amidst an admittedly very serious domestic terrorism problem in the country that has increased at the same time since the military coup. This creates a painful dilemma for the United States, right? I think that sometimes people in looking at U.S. policy are more cynical than I think it really should be, and people think that the United States government approves, for example, of having a military that we've worked with for a long time run the country. That's not my experience with U.S. officials. I think they're deeply uncomfortable with it, right? And that they don't really approve of the military running the politics and the economy of the country, and they don't really approve of how the Egyptian military is running the country. And they're concerned that the way the Egyptian military is running things is actually fueling the terrorist insurgency and so forth. But at the same time, they don't want to pull the rug out from underneath the Egyptian government. Okay, I'll come back to that point, but I think that's one of the things that's keeping this relationship and this security relationship going, despite all the misgivings that I know that U.S. officials and certainly members of Congress have. So the second point I want to make is this. We often, again, you know, in our cynical Washington way of looking at things, we think that these security relationships are immune from any concern about shared values between the United States and the recipient country. But in reality, I don't think that's true. I don't think these relationships are immune. I think that persistent difference, so in the case of Egypt, and there are other cases, Bilal hinted at this as well, where there are persistent differences between the United States and the partner country about the nature of the threats that they face, about how to address these threats. Those spring oftentimes, I think, from different values and different worldviews, right? Bilal was talking about how much easier this is sometimes for the United States working, for example, with European allies and so forth. And it causes these relationships to deteriorate over time, these persistent differences that go back, I think, to differences in values and worldviews. And this is what has happened with Egypt. There has been a long-term sort of slow deterioration in this relationship between the United States and Egypt. You know, in a way, so the original rationale for the relationship, the Egyptian-Israeli peace, in a way, has been at least at least partially successful, right? There have been no more wars between Egypt and Israel. We don't envision any coming. The peace treaty has held. We all know it's a cold peace. It never developed in the way that maybe a lot of people would have hoped it would, but it has held. And so, and it has its own, long since has had its own rationale. The idea that the United States has to be right in the middle, triangulating, you know, with Egypt and Israel, it's just no longer the case. So the relationship moved on to be a little bit more about the stability of Egypt and about the development of Egypt. And there was a time when there was a big economic development component of this relationship, but that withered away over time, and also because of persistent differences between the two countries. You know, Lee Litzenberger said something interesting. He was talking about the purpose of security security assistance is to build relationships. And I would say, I think that's true, that's honest. But the relationships sometimes become an end in themselves, just to have a relationship. And there's some kind of assumption built in there that if we have a relationship, we will then agree on the essential issues. But that's not the case. It doesn't necessarily work that way, and it hasn't worked that way with Egypt, right? So even now, I mentioned Egypt faces a serious terrorist insurgency. It's in the Sinai, but also there are components, or related, maybe unrelated, in the Nile Valley, in the Western Desert, and so forth. It's very serious. But the United States and Egypt have persistently had, differences of views about how to handle this. Egypt has wanted to handle it primarily with military force, with political repression, massive arrests and so forth. And the United States tends to think, okay, yes, all right, yes, there will be military force needed, and there will be, but what you really need to do is to get the cooperation of your population against the terrorists. That's, at the end of the day, that's what you really need to do to win against a terrorist insurgency. And there's been a lot of, disagreements, about that. I mean, right now the Egyptian government is in the middle of a big campaign in the Sinai. They proudly announced I don't know if they've got something like 42,000 soldiers in the Sinai right now against what everybody thinks is maybe fewer than 1,000 terrorists. And there's been a lot of concerns about the use of U.S. provided equipment. Wendy Chamberlain mentioned the story just over the last couple of days about the use of cluster munitions. There's evidence, couple of different pieces of video evidence, helpfully provided by the Egyptian army, about the use of, that they are using cluster munitions in Sinai. There has been video evidence of extrajudicial killings in the Sinai, and both of these involve equipment provided by the United States. So it starts to involve U.S. law. There's increasing public differences between the United States and Egypt over other issues as well. And a couple of them, one of them is Egypt's long-running relationship with North Korea, which has a military component. I know it's a major source of irritation for the current administration. And the other one is the Egyptian government's hostile treatment of American as well as Egyptian non-governmental organizations in the country. So another one also, I think, although it's maybe manageable at the current time, but Egypt's interventions in Libya and its support for General Haftar in Libya. It's something that right now is manageable. The United States and Egypt are talking about this, but it certainly can be a matter of friction. Okay, so there are all these disagreements. So let me just say something about the Trump administration and how things are shifting a little bit. Now, in the Obama administration, there was a good bit of tension between the Egyptian and U.S. governments, and I think that President Obama didn't show much affection for President Sisi in Egypt and so forth. But in general, I mean, right after the military coup, military assistance was was withheld for a while. Or I should say it was really right after the mass killing in August of 2013 that followed the coup. Military assistance was withheld for a while and it was eventually given back. Right near the end of the Obama administration, they did do something, which was this withholding of cash flow financing, which someone asked a question about earlier. And that has meant that Egypt can no longer make this sort of multi-year advance purchases counting on U.S. military assistance that it used to be able to do. And the Obama administration did that on purpose because they felt that Egypt was making, kept making these big contracts for heavy weaponry, conventional weaponry and so forth, which wasn't really what was needed to fight the insurgency. So what's interesting is that the Trump administration, even though President Trump has come in, showing a lot more approval somehow for President Sisi and inviting him to Washington and all of that, the Trump administration kept that in place. And they've also done something which is really very unusual in this relationship. Last August, they actually reprogrammed, in other words, took away from Egypt and gave to other countries some aid, about $97 million, 2/3 of its security assistance. And then they placed a hold on an additional $195 million of security assistance for Egypt, saying that they had some specific concerns that needed to be addressed. And I think at least a couple of the things I mentioned, the relationship with North Korea and this NGO issue, are on that list of concerns that have to be addressed before this assistance will be released. It's not clear whether this will work. The administration has kept this going for about 6 months now. We'll see. But there's also, subsequent years of assistance also have congressionally mandated conditionality built into them. So between the Congress writing these conditions into assistance and the end of the cash flow financing arrangement, this administration has a lot more leverage over this relationship. They have a lot more freedom of action of moving forward military assistance or not with Egypt than previous administrations did, and they're using it, right? It seems to be that there's more of a willingness in this administration to make some specific demands and withhold assistance. Look at what they're doing with Pakistan, with Cambodia. And by the way, the withholding assistance from Pakistan is about differences on how to handle terrorist groups. The withholding assistance from Cambodia is about the undermining of democratic procedures in that country. Both of these are issues with Egypt as well. Now, not in the same way. I think no one is claiming that, that Egypt is supporting terrorist actions against Americans or our allies the way, related to Pakistan. So it's not the same thing. I don't want to say it's the same thing, but they are similar issues. And it shows, I think, that this administration is willing to play a bit rougher, and it's willing to try to use this security assistance as leverage and to hold it back, especially if it thinks that somehow the relationship with the United States is being abused. Look, admittedly, I think there's a big dilemma for the United States what to do about Egypt. The United States and the Egyptians can never seem to agree on how best to support the country's stability and its development. But on the other hand, the United States and certainly allies in Europe very much fear what would happen if there would be massive instability in Egypt, and we don't want to be the cause of that. So as I said, there's a little bit of a concern about, well, we don't want to pull the rug out somehow, and because, as I started out with, these assistance relationships are not just about the technicalities. They're a signal of support for this, for this regime and for this military. And that's exactly the problem we face. What do we do when we want to support the stability of the country and maybe even want to support the capability of the military so they can defend the country, but we don't agree with the way they're doing things? That's the problem that we face with Egypt, and it's really very very difficult. I do think that we're moving into a situation where the United States is going to be getting more serious about seeing that our assistance isn't used for harmful purposes, for purposes that are against U.S. interests, that can come back to haunt us. You know, with Egypt, we're going to have to be looking more carefully at legal provisions and so forth on end-use monitoring and that kind of thing, because there's growing concern, and a lot of this is driven from Congress. So I think the whole relationship with Egypt, and certainly the security relationship, it's really up for a good rethink. And maybe, as President Sisi seems likely to start a new mandate in a very undemocratic election, this could be a time to do that rethink.
Great. Well, thank you, all of you, for those interesting presentations. We are going to do a very quick round of questioning that I'll lead, and then we'll open it up to the audience in about 8 minutes. So we're just going to do this pretty quick. I actually just want to begin by building on a point that you made at the end, Michele, which was, you know, how the Trump administration is handling aid to Egypt. I guess the question for the panel and would be, how is the Trump administration handling security assistance to the region in a significantly different way than past administrations? Because the Obama administration also withheld aid in certain situations, or, you know, decided not to go forward with planned arms sales as a point of leverage. I don't know who wants to address that question.
I'll just give a very brief answer. So the Hill actually has been most interesting, I think, on this front. And Michele's comments on Egypt are spot on, but I would get actually like a process answer. So Capitol Hill in the last year or so has streamlined a whole bunch of security assistance authorities, because it actually was very difficult to even figure out which country was getting how much money in which bucket. And so the Hill has not only streamlined its authorities, it's also required the Pentagon to actually report who's getting assistance. The first version of that just came out about a week and a half or so ago. It is a first step. It's somewhat lackluster, but it's an initial effort. What I would also say is there is an increased push within the Pentagon to try to actually assess the extent to which these programs are having the effect that they're supposed to or not. So outside of kind of Trump administration politics, there's some really interesting and important steps happening both on the Hill and inside the Pentagon.
Great. The next question I have, so one of the many goals of U.S. security assistance is to build up the military capability, obviously, of the partner countries with the effect to take the burden off of U.S. forces when facing counterterrorism or other threats. To what extent have we actually succeeded in doing that, in allowing local militaries to supplant the American military? It seems to me that we remain the indispensable military in the region, but I'd be interested in your thoughts here.
I can make a couple of general observations, but maybe, Justin, you want to dig a little bit deeper into Iraq and maybe Syria, Mara. For a good reason, we've all been pounding on security assistance, mentioning all the failures and the problems with the enterprise. But we have to remember that this thing really worked very well in the past. It's only until after the end of the Cold War where things started to really become more complex, because the world changed. It's that simple, and the threats became more diffuse. In the past, security assistance was really very beneficial. It helped us maintain our access to territory, to airspace in the region, upholding the Camp David Treaty. We pried the Egyptians away from the Soviets. We restricted the Shah's access to Moscow. I mean, it was a lot of good things, and not to mention also the economics of this. We haven't really said a word about the economics, and we've had huge profits coming out of this, which obviously contributes to employment in here, to the job industry in here. I think since 9/11, things changed, but just more recent successes, since you mentioned since that's your question, Missy, I mean, nobody's mentioned Jordan, obviously. I think Jordan's relatively, given there's not a single case that's perfect or without problems, but I think Jordan is a relatively successful example, especially its elite military units. I don't like to call them special operations forces, they're just elite military units. The UAE also is a good example of its own special operations commandos. I think there's a good bit of success with the Lebanese army. I don't doubt that one second. But I think the list ends there, really, frankly, unless you want to throw in a little bit Saudi Arabia and what we've been able to do to try to help them out crush the insurgency of Al-Qaeda in the mid-2000s. But that was still a limited effort, obviously, and it had a number of other consequences. Iraq's counterterrorism service. I think this is the crowning achievement of the United States in Iraq. It's been extremely successful. But, of course, you have to add the huge caveat that, well, the Iraqi military collapsed miserably at the initial onslaught of ISIS. So, you know, add to that, it's a very mixed bag in the region, obviously, but there's been a number of successes that, you know, it's never been perfect. So maybe Justin want to add a little bit more about Iraq.
I would just say thanks, Bilal. So I think just more broadly, it depends on scope. You know, what do you want to accomplish? Do you want an elite force, whether that's Spec Ops or whatever? Yeah, that's not that hard to do, and partly because this was, prior to 9/11, this was Spec Ops mission. This was a special forces, you know, bread and butter. You go into another, a place that regular military are not. You train up your guys, and you know, and you're right. There's many instances where this was successful. Iraq is another instance where I think scope got the better of us. Yeah, we had created a very good counterterrorism force, and then we left. I happened to be the first U.S. aircraft to go back into Iraq to deliver security assistance in the form of rockets when this unnamed terrorist organization, who we were told was worse than Al-Qaeda, was threatening Baghdad. Obviously, that ended up being ISIS, and I was blown away at that time because I had literally spent the previous 5 years training Iraqi pilots, training, and then watching them go on to fly aircraft that had been provided by the United States. You know, when I went into Baghdad, it was 2013, I guess. There was nothing going on, and we're talking about a country that's under siege. There's aircraft, brand new aircraft provided by the United States, were sitting idle on the deck there. So, to answer the question more broadly, we have successes in some areas, and there were, you know, yes, they've essentially flushed ISIS more or less out, but I think a big part of that was, you know, it was almost as if there was an external actor. When ISIS took over territory, they became an external threat in the same way that, you know, the Warsaw Pact might have been, or it allowed us to incorporate ourselves as a co-combatant. I'm going to steal that term from Mara, in ways that perhaps helped us along in that path. But it's still difficult to call it a success. It was you know, using a sledgehammer where, you know, a screwdriver may have made more sense.
Okay, just one very quick last question before we open it up. How should we think about providing security assistance to governments that have components or elements to them, be it military or political, that are seen as hostile to the United States? I'm thinking of the PMF and its supporters in Iraq as they become integrated into the security forces, and then have some of their leadership in key ministries in the government, and then obviously Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Lauren?
Sure. So it depends a little bit on the moment in time. So if your moment in time is Iraq summer 2014, you're going to be desperate enough to work with just about anyone, right? And I think you saw that, and I think, you know, we have Syria examples too, where perhaps standards were different, and you saw the U.S., for I think reasons that in some ways make sense, really focused on working with anyone it could just to fight back kind of the scourge that is ISIS. Things get a lot harder, obviously, when you talk about integration and what happens after, what happens when people aren't worried that a state is about to collapse. So if you use if you use PMF as an example, there have been some efforts in Iraq to try to integrate the PMF. The question will be, there are a number of different militias who have a number of different masters. Ideally, you want them all to have one master, and you want it to be the Iraqi government. That is going to be a sort of a haphazard process, and you might have to make accommodations that are less comfortable. So there's a great example at the end of the Lebanese civil war. Every militia through the Taif Accord is supposed to give up its arms. So generally everyone does, except for Hezbollah. Hezbollah's argument is, well, this doesn't really apply to us. We have another purpose. And I think there were arguments for accepting that at that moment in time, because you had just seen this kind of horrific status quo in Lebanon for 15 plus years. So going forward, to what extent is the relationship with Hezbollah and the Lebanese military one of just deconfliction, which is, I think, kind of somewhat reasonable, because, let there be no bones about it. Hezbollah is a whole lot better trained and equipped and more capable than the Lebanese military. No one should have any illusions about that question whatsoever. The question then is how much do you see simply deconfliction between those two forces, and how much do you actually see an active collaboration? And how concerned are you that work with the Lebanese military is then, say, information, intel, you name it, going to Hezbollah? Because then it becomes a little bit of a different ballgame.
All right, okay, we have almost 30 minutes. I'm gonna open it up. Please raise your hands, and I think there are mics. Just identify yourself, your affiliation, and make sure that your question is a question. The woman here in the red?
Hi, Marissa Khurma. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm a non-resident fellow at New American and do consulting and international development. I want to take the conversation back to basically the national interest and supporting the military with all this money going into military institutions in the region at the expense of good governance and basically strong institutions on the governmental side. That creates, over time, other security threats. And then in Jordan, for example, multiple polls show that trust in the military is very, very high, in like the high 80%, and there's very low trust in government. And of course, over time, it creates security challenges. So how do these things, how are these things balanced out, and where do you start that conversation in Washington? Thank you.
Yeah, let me start with the example of Egypt. So what's interesting is, back in the late 70s, when the bilateral U.S.-Egyptian relationship really got going as a part of the overall peace with Israel process and so forth, the U.S. assistance program to Egypt initially was evenly balanced dollar-wise between economic and security assistance. It was about $1 billion of each. The whole thing was about $2.1 billion, and then a few years later it shifted a bit, and it became about $800 million in economic assistance and $1.3 billion in military assistance. It went forward that way for many years. Then the economic side of the relationship started to wither. For a lot of reasons, the argument was made there are a lot of countries that are poorer than Egypt and so forth that need the economic assistance more. But it was also, and then it went down, down, down because of disagreements, because of persistent disagreements about things relating to the economy and to the political setup, the institutions that you mentioned and so forth. And it was easier for the United States to cut the economic assistance to Egypt and to keep the military assistance to Egypt going because, again, that was like, well, that was getting down to the stability of the country and the U.S. relationship with the military that we didn't want to give up and so forth. But it led to this imbalance in the relationship, ever since then, I think. I believe the budget request that was put forward by the Trump administration was for, again, $1.3 billion in security assistance and 150 million in economic assistance for Egypt for the next year. And so, and then you look at the really pretty dire economic straits that the country is in and so forth. So, yeah, what can I tell you? You know, I mean, it really does happen that these relationships take on a life of their own, and that somehow the military assistance is seen as more vital than other kinds of assistance or other kinds of engagement. But then pretty soon you end up having a relationship that is more or less confined to the security channel, and sometimes, and I would say this was the case with Egypt, not even that terrific in that channel either.
Could I add one quick point on that? I just want to say, you know, you do have this challenge where oftentimes countries are more amenable to the United States working with their militaries than trying to, say, strengthen their judicial sector. That was a good example just for Lebanon. But this is also a U.S. story, too, right? You have widespread support for pretty robust support for the U.S. military, and much less so for building the State Department or funding the State Department in any way. And in all of these examples, it leads to a totally skewed balance of power.
Bilal, I think you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's important to distinguish between FMF and FMS. Obviously, FMS, you know, I'm not going to say we have non-existent leverage, but we certainly have much reduced leverage to engage in these conversations about governance. When the customer comes with you with cash, it's really difficult, especially when you're facing stiff competition in the international arms market. But that's there's a reason why we have a DASD for security assistance. And I think that Tommy Ross, who's a friend of Mara and I before, really had an emphasis on institutional capacity building. And this is now becoming much more prominent, at least in the lexicon of security assistance. Now, obviously, it's going to take more than a week to really integrate it into our processes, but it's certainly a concern, obviously.
Let me just add the last little bit. That defense institution building is becoming more, it's getting the press I think it needs, but there's also a more pragmatic reason why often we don't do other kinds of reforms, is that we don't have people who deploy to do that.
Right.
And this was one of the findings in the Inspector General for Afghanistan's report recently, was that, hey, you know, like it'd be great if we could do a lot of judicial reforms, but it's hard to deploy police. We don't have that kind of capability in the United States.
Just don't call it nation building, that's all.
Okay, next question. I think here in the front row, the gentleman in the sweater, and then we'll go.
I'm Will Embry from DynCorp International. First, let me say this is a fabulous panel. Thank you very much. But, you know, maybe Michele's exception, you know, you're all pretty much true believers in security assistance. You know, one of the U.S. goals of security assistance is to stabilize weak countries, you know, strengthen the government so they won't get overthrown. They can control things in the country. RAND did a major study a couple of years ago where it compared the amount of security assistance provided to countries against, failure of countries, and their conclusion was that the very small amount of money that INL provides, things that Mara was just talking about, governance, rule of law, you know, civilian security, et cetera, are much more effective at strengthening the state than is the very large amount of military assistance. You know, what's your reaction to that? You think we ought to be, you know, well, it's easier to give military stuff because they like it and because our industry wants to promote it. You know, shouldn't you all, or we, be promoting doing things that are more economic governance assistance than security assistance?
Who wants to tackle that?
Sure, I will. Thank you for your comments. I find it really curious that you're seeing us all as true diehard believers, because I'm actually not sure that's the case. I think Michele is spot on in using the example of Egypt. The point of the U.S. relationship with Egypt's military was never to build a superb military, right? It was to make sure the Camp David Accords were abided by. And that's important to note. Now, that view has evolved over the years, and Michele is about 400 times smarter than I am on this topic, but it comes down to a lot, I think also, as we were hearing earlier from Justin, you know, why are you doing this? What are you trying to get out of it? Oftentimes, I think you will find the people who spend the most time thinking about these issues are the truest believers for other types of assistance, right? So trying to get judiciary strengthened, trying to strengthen police, absolutely. The challenge is you don't have a whole lot of constituencies there. You don't have it in Washington, right? You don't have it on the Hill. Moreover, a lot of these countries, as I said earlier, are often rather discomfited because that really feels like mucking about. It doesn't come with all sorts of exciting things like F-16s. Anyone else?
I mean, I have a very, very simple answer. The reason why I'm a believer is because it worked in the past. And the reason why it's not working now, it's not because it's philosophically incoherent or strategically invaluable. It's because we're not doing it right. And so to give up on that because of our own faults, frankly, is a non-starter.
Yeah, and I think it also just, I mentioned before, it comes down to scope. What do you want out of this? And if we have a coherent policy that addresses our myriad of touch points in the relationship, led by our chief diplomat, then it can really pay dividends. Where it is misinformed by other actors or just by the neglect of the bureaucracy in general, or the inability to develop a long-term strategy in this, or people who are experts in it. And that's another topic we haven't really touched on yet. We might get into that later. That's where I'm a believer, at least, that we can make those changes. But you're right. I think that it needs to come along with governance issues. And I do think there's been some efforts to make that so. We'll see if it really comes about.
Can I just add one point? Well, I would just say this. I think if the United States were going to be working with the governments of countries who really believed in strengthening the state through building institutions, as you were discussing, through building, the rule of law and capable police forces and, all kinds of things like that, as opposed to governments who believe in strengthening themselves by adding coercive military force and adding, fighter aircraft and tanks and so forth, we'll be working with a whole different set of countries. Exactly. Right? There is a little bit of overlap here or there. I would raise maybe Tunisia as an example of a country whose government really does want international help in strengthening its institutions at this point. But the whole set of people we'd be working with would look different.
Right.
All right, the gentleman by the window.
Good afternoon, Andy Cook, student and a former practitioner like Justin, involved in mentoring Iraqi security forces and liaising with Afghan national security forces. My question really is, going back to Marla's point about mission, because military capacity building is completely different from security sector assistance. And we're aiming at this big ticket approach to say, we'll sell you M1 Abrams, we'll sell you F-16s, but that's not the mission that we actually want you to participate in. The UK and French Marines were involved in mentoring and training the Makri al-Bar in Lebanon, but their mission that they've been predominantly focused on is an internal security mission. Right. And internal security, it's not the function of a conventional military.
Absolutely.
Now, that's going back to Justin's point about special operations forces, and again, your point about the CTS in Iraq. So, should we really get our grips with what are we actually trying to do? Is it about FMS? Right. Do we think that giving them fancy kit will make them interoperable with us and actually do what we want them to do? Because I don't think that actually is the case.
Yeah.
Is there a question there?
Yeah. How do we get after what we really want to achieve? FMF is different than security sector assistance, is it not?
All right. Anyone want to tackle that?
Yeah, I mean, look, as I mentioned, security systems is such a broad umbrella, and it's not just FMF and FMS. Obviously, it's becoming much broader than that, and there are many new baskets that have been created since, obviously, the counter-ISIS campaign, and then it's just a whole separate fund for Afghanistan. So it's just a huge enterprise, obviously. And I agree with you that the mission itself is oftentimes ill-defined. But we can agree on this, though. Never have we defined a mission for these militaries to actually win wars. So we can try to train them as much as we can, advise them as much as we can, and hope that one day they will be in a position to win wars. But have never really had expectations for them to play a leading role in defeating the enemy. That has been quite clear in the department where Mara has worked, and obviously I'm pretty sure that Justin knows that as well. Greater clarity on mission, that's great, but let's not expect these armies to really contribute to much loftier goals of defeating the enemy or of taking territory or what have you.
Okay, next question. The gentleman in the bow tie.
Yeah, I'm Chris Straub with the Amar Foundation, which is a charity that works in Iraq. But my question is not about Iraq. Rather, it's about Saudi Arabia as an example of some of the things we've been talking about. Because the whatever the purpose of the aid is, the actual items that they buy, and it's not aid, it's regular money, yeah. But they feed the impression in the country, in the military leadership, that power is a matter of sophisticated weaponry. And now we look at the example of Yemen, where the Saudis can make the sky dark with sophisticated airplanes. The Houthis don't have anything. The Houthis are the client of a state that has 14 fighters, hasn't had aviation parts since the Shah's time. And guess what? The Houthis still own half of Yemen. So, you know, it seems to me that's a major disaster.
So
do you agree?
Anyone? How does security assistance stack up with the potential for asymmetric capabilities?
Right.
Mara,
if you want to say a word on this, I'm happy to.
Sure. So the first comment I have to make, thank you, Chris, for that great question, is not exactly how do you deal with asymmetry. It's actually that the program that I worry the most about is the U.S. effort to work with the Saudi military, because it is so incredibly devolved. You have work with different parts of the military services, you have the National Guard Bureau, all sorts of competitive elements, and I have yet to see any real clarity in terms of what the mission is. Back to that sort of first point, why are you working with this military? Particularly in my experience, you see how little the different entities from the United States that are working with these pieces even talk to one another. There's a bad story there, and it's only a matter of time before something problematic happens and everyone looks around and says, all right, who do I point the finger toward? And they're not going to know. That said, the question I did hear from you is, so how do you actually help a military figure out how to fight asymmetrically? You know, the challenge, of course, is the Saudi military is not really used to fighting, period. And fighting asymmetrically is arguably a whole lot harder. It's not kind of just a lesser included task. I would say, you know, if we look particularly at the literature, a lot of it comes down to the personnel and how they are learning to actually fight. You know, Yemen was a dysfunctional, chaotic place pre-Houthis and pre the Saudis doing all they can to really cause further chaos, arguably on Yemeni territory. A lot of this comes down to, first of all, there's the period of time where the Saudis are just starting to fight, right, starting to drop bombs for effectively their first time, et cetera. But going forward, a lot more of it comes down to reorganization. It's coming down to having the right people in key positions. So I just saw that they've pushed a couple folks out. I'm hoping that this is a much belated but necessary Saudi recognition that its conflict in Yemen has been just a terrible failure with profound humanitarian costs.
I would just say, or add too, that Saudi Arabia is obviously a case unto itself. In terms of what the motivations are there. As we mentioned, you know, there's no getting around the fact that they're a tremendous buyer of American weaponry and others as well. They have the coffers to do it, and particularly now they have a operational need for it in terms of at least they are prosecuting you know, a war. You know, you want to talk about how difficult asymmetrical warfare is. We've been in Afghanistan for going on 16 years, and we do pretty well everywhere else. So it's hard, and they're finding that for sure. Now, whether or not they need all those F-15Ss and Abrams, et cetera, or whether they'll put them to good use in Yemen, obviously we'll see. But I think the other part of this is, and this gets back to it in many ways as well. I trained a lot of Saudi pilots. You know, the intention is that we have a foot in the door. We have a say, or we're intended to have a say in how they prosecute that war. We're intended to have the elite of their forces having been to our schools, having having exposure to the things that the rights that we or the way we expect a military to behave. Now, you can argue back and forth, I think, with some very good points about whether or not they've adhered to that. And obviously, we've used that as a carrot. The Obama administration certainly did, to say, hey, well, we're not going to make these weapons transfers until you comply with with the way we believe you should be behaving. So I think that's a different aspect, and it's a different rationale for security assistance in a place where there is relative peace in Saudi Arabia, but a very sophisticated economy with a sophisticated military we were transferring weapons to.
Yeah, I'll just make a crucial distinction that speaks to your excellent comment. No matter how powerful and lethal the weapon system is, it really is not synonymous with the military capability. When you're talking about capabilities, you're talking about strategy, doctrine, leadership, all sorts of tactics and other things that many elements of which the Saudis lack. And so it's not just the stuff that they buy from us, it's all the other soft things that go within the weapon system that they're still struggling to adapt to. I made an example in my article where, if I go buy a Ferrari tomorrow, it's not going to make me a better car driver. So.
I'd just like to add a word, Missy. Look, I think this case is something that the United States really, has to look at really seriously, because let's face it, we were kind of dragged into supporting a Saudi military intervention in Yemen that we were not enthusiastic about. Yep. Both because we didn't think it would succeed, and anyway, we didn't think it was the right way of solving the problem. Obviously, having the Houthis with whatever degree of Iranian support they have running across Yemen was a bad situation for the Saudis, and we understand that, and that needed to be dealt with in some ways. Was this the way to deal with it? I don't think that. Even at the time, I really don't think that American policymakers during the Obama administration were enthusiastic about that. But for various reasons, they decided they have to go along with it. And so we have to look at it's a little bit kind of the dark side of some of these relationships. So we're building relationships. But then when you've got the relationship and the person you're in the relationship with does something you think is misguided and with potentially tragic repercussions, I think that faces the United States with some very difficult choices, and ones in which I think, in this case, the U.S. administration didn't, I think, make the right choices at the time, and we've gotten dragged into this.
And I think Pakistan obviously would be another country where there's a question about whether the security assistance and the military relationship has successfully brought about the political leverage and the decision making on part of the partner state.
Yeah.
Could I just add to that, Missy? Because it's an issue of prioritization. Is your top priority making sure that Pakistan has solid command and control of its nuclear weapons, or is it that they actually fight bad guys, and which bad guys? And I think that has been a very hard conversation for the United States, for the U.S. government to have with itself over the last 17 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think here in the tan sweater.
Hi, Melissa Reynolds, Justin's spouse, but also PhD candidate at Rutgers. I have a question to bring it back to DC, and not so much the region. I'm just curious what you guys take. I've heard a lot of conversation about nation building. We don't say that, it's a dirty word. We don't want to talk about the fact that what we're really trying to do maybe is make some cultural changes. And I'm wondering what you guys think about the Trump administration's emphasis and sort of naked ambition to sell more US military equipment, and if that might ironically bring what's actually happening most often in security assistance to the fore, if it could result in actual policy changes. Whereas before, I feel like perhaps we were uncomfortable with being quite so explicit about the fact that so much of this program comes from just us selling our military equipment to other countries. If actually by making that that component of security assistance more visible, if it could in some way bring about changes to policy that acknowledge the reality on the ground. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense.
I'll say a word about that. Well, maybe this is controversial, but I have no problem with selling more weapons. That's not the issue. But I think what the Trump administration is trying to do, and I think they termed their own efforts at fixing this whole thing, is Buy American. I think this is their, this is what they labeled it. as long as we're not confusing things. If you want to sell more arms, that's fine, but don't confuse it as a serious rethink of all the problems that we've discussed today. It's not about, as I mentioned earlier, selling more or selling less. And I don't really buy the theories that these arms sales contribute to militarization in the region. There are far more other variables that contribute to that. These are all theories that have never been tested. But let's not confuse the better sales pitch, which I think the Trump administration is interested in doing, with a serious strategic rethink of security assistance that reintegrates it into foreign policy.
I think we have time for one more very quick question here in with the tie, the blue tie.
Hello, so thanks again. It's Russian Embassy, Arthur Lukmanov, and really thankful to your deep discussions, quite professional and very enthusiastic in terms of promoting foreign policy of the United States. You know, we disagree here on some points, and I wanted to hear you on that side of security assistance, that you mean to align it with the political goals of the United States, and to develop the issue that was raised on the paramilitary forces, which are now a reality in the Middle East and beyond. And in many countries, they became a political factor or a party, like in Lebanon, when we speak about Hezbollah, or what was going on now in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and many other countries. With this narrative of the U.S. government, anti-Hezbollah narrative, don't you think that aligning this security policy with political goals, you bring your Lebanese partners to a divide, to frictions? You know how fragile Lebanon is, that Hezbollah is a part of the country. They are in the government, they are in the parliament. So do you think it's realistic? It might, don't you think it might cause tensions outside and inside the country? Thank you.
Okay, we have 1 minute. I'm going to give the question to our Lebanon specialist here.
Sure. Thanks for your question. Yeah, it's rich to hear about the idea of causing tension and destabilizing the region. So I appreciate you raising that. Here's what I would say. I don't think anyone in Washington believes that the effort to build the Lebanese military is an effort to therefore neutralize Hezbollah. At the end of the day, it comes down to showing that the Lebanese government, and through it, its military, is able to exert its sovereignty in a responsible way throughout its state. That story is a security story, obviously, but it's also much bigger, per the good questions we were hearing earlier, right? It's having a Lebanese judicial system that people trust. So when someone gets assassinated, they know that there'll be a real investigation, right? It's having Lebanese social services actually capable enough to pick up the garbage throughout Lebanon. It's a much bigger story than that. And to the extent that Hezbollah is still able to play a role in the security sector and a role in the social services sector, that makes things harder for the Lebanese government, which hopefully can find a way to step up its game.
Can I just say one final word? I'm originally from Lebanon. You're not going to believe me if I tell you this, but the only reason why, or the most important reason why we prefer to work with the Lebanese military, it is because it is the only cross-sectarian institution in the country, really. There is no ulterior motive about at some point confronting Hezbollah or whatever. It's just part of what we call the state building process and democracy consolidation in Lebanon. There is no other ulterior motive, and believe it or not.
All right, well, listen, I think I want to thank our panelists today, and thank you so much for being here and for your questions. Have a great day.